is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
I'm joined today by a very special guest, longtime friend and a huge contributor to the world of Web3 and crypto, Chris Giancarlo. Chris is the senior counsel and co-chair of the Willkie Digital Works practice. And he's based in the firm's New York office. He also served as the 13th chairman of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, better known as the CFTC, where he oversaw regulation of the futures, options, and swaps derivatives market. The CFTC, as many of our listeners know, is the regulator of one of the largest financial marketplaces in the entire world, and is also a key player in the growing regulatory environment around crypto assets. Chris is also known to some in the industry as CryptoDad because for a time he was one of the few adults in the room. I've been at it for so long, Chris, as you know, that I've myself become a crypto dad in the literal and also the metaphorical sense. I go to these conferences and I find that I'm about 15 years older than the average attendee. So, but for a time that was your role, and I know you're still incredibly active in so many different aspects of the industry. We're very fortunate to have you on this episode today because this is an election year. And it seems as if the die has been cast for November, barring any crazy unforeseen circumstances of who is going to be running for both major political parties. And what's increasingly in the news, other than the fact that crypto's hitting all-time highs, or at least that's true for Bitcoin, is that the industry is seemingly a lot more organized and is spending some money and dedicating some resources to helping to put Web3 or crypto, if you like it, on the ballot for November. And that's not just to influence presidential candidates, because who knows what those guys make of it, but down ballot opportunities as well in the Senate and the House and so forth. So, Chris, first of all, before I jump into it, welcome. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. And why don't we just start there? It's an election year. What do you make of these reports that the industry is dedicating resources, and can Web3 kind of make it onto the agenda as a real election issue in November?
Yeah, Alex, great opening question, and there's a lot to tease out in this. I also want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you. I as you know, I'm a huge fan of the work you've done, and honored to be mentioned in your Revolution series of books and recent Web3. Great work, and you continue to do great work. So the call to join you today really was one that I jumped on. Really great to be with you.
Thank you.
You're absolutely right. This is not only an election year here in the United States, it's election year pretty much in many of the world's democracies around the world. I think I've seen a statistic that says about 60% of the inhabitants of the world's democracies will be voting in leadership elections this year, including France, including Britain, and of course the United States, India. So major elections all around the world this year. So and the question I think you're asking is, what role will crypto play in that? And we're absolutely seeing that here in the United States at every level. I think, well, let's say every federal level, but also in some state races as well. The states have always been a laboratory of experimentation in the United States, and lately you've seen some states like Wyoming and Idaho and others move to open their states up to greater degree of experimentation and leadership in the whole digital asset crypto space. And I understand at the state level, those have been hotly contested, with crypto now coming out to playing a leadership role in some of those states. At the federal level here in the United States, we, as everyone knows, have a big presidential election. As you know, Alex, but maybe some of your listeners don't know, I had the honor to serve in both the Obama and Trump administrations. During the last 2.5 years of the Obama administration, I served as a commissioner of the 5-member Commodity Futures Trading Commission in Washington, which oversees markets for risk transfer in the United States, which are basically derivative products. In 2017, with the election of President Trump, I was named as chairman of the agency and continued for the last 2.5 years of my 5-year term in the role of chairman. And during my time, oversaw the launch of Bitcoin futures, the world's first regulated market for any type of crypto whatsoever. And that now 5 years later, that market is deep, it's liquid, it's transparent, it's well regulated. It's the basis for the launch of Bitcoin ETFs here in the United States. But the reason why I mentioned it is to get to your question. The Trump administration's approach to crypto during that time, during the first Trump administration, was neutral to indifferent, is how I would describe it. They did not interfere with our independent decision at the CFTC to greenlight the creation of a regulated market for Bitcoin futures. The change of the guard to the Biden administration has resulted in an administration that is pretty well recognized for being quite outwardly hostile to crypto and crypto innovation. And I won't, there's lots of incidents and evidence of that, but I think it's broadly well established that this is a fairly hostile administration. And the President Biden's just introduced budget in the last 48 hours has proposed taxes on Bitcoin mining, has proposed taxes on crypto transactions. So you might say that they're projecting forward a continuation into a second Biden term of that relative hostile approach. Interestingly, Trump as a candidate is now signaling greater openness to crypto. In an interview he gave to one of the broadcast services this week, he talked about the fact that some of his commercial operations were now accepting Bitcoin as a means of payment, and he spoke highly of Bitcoin as a means of payment. Now, those in the know it's actually has its shortcomings as a means of payment, but he spoke highly of it. He didn't speak about it as a store of value, which I think many of your listeners probably would recognize. It's one of its better use cases, relatively speaking. But he did speak highly and did say that he would, I think he said some words to not seek to ban it if he became president. So the reason I mention all this is I think you're seeing a political divide at the presidential election in the United States between a Biden administration that proposes continuation of a relatively antagonistic approach to digital assets and to crypto, and a Trump administration that's still evolving its policy, but is at least signaling as of late an openness. And I can tell you from my own experience during the Trump administration, they never sought to interfere with our going forward with Bitcoin futures. So I would think that voters in this case, and you also asked about the state level, there's been some very effective...
Maybe just to drill down on that a little bit. I mean, it sounds somewhat like the devil on this particular issue, putting aside how you feel about either candidate, the devil you know versus the devil you don't know, because, Trump's policies are often evolving, to put it charitably, based on, the whims of the moment. Is how I think a lot of people feel. And I'm wondering, just putting aside the politics of it for a moment, what would you say the industry hopes to have as a framework in the United States? I think what is the ideal state? Is it, leave us alone and let us tinker, and we, the less regulation, the better? Or is it give us some guidance and create a framework here so that we can, know what the rules of the road are going forward? My instinct is that there are definitely some in the crypto anarchist sort of community who would prefer the former, but I think most people in the business kind of are thinking the latter, right? If this is a new era of the web, how do you create the conditions for it to succeed and evolve and become meaningful economically in the United States, right?
Yeah. So Alex, I think while there are those factors, the crypto nihilists that would say just leave us alone, in my own experience as the head of one of the U.S.'s major regulatory agencies dealing with crypto, and through that experience, having met with all the major players in the space or during the course of that time and since, will tell you that actually crypto, I don't think, is much different than most other industries, in that what they want is a great degree of certainty. Tell us what the rules are so that we can design our compliance processes to put us in compliance. It's not much more complicated than that. I think the crypto industry is no different than the automotive industry or the natural gas industry or the healthcare industry. Tell us what the rules are. Clarify for us what the rules are, and we'll comply. When we launched when we greenlighted Bitcoin futures in December 2017, the CFTC, we laid out an approach to crypto that we called heightened scrutiny because it was a new asset class. And we were very clear what the compliance requirements are. And it was remarkable how positive the industry response was, because for the first time, they knew what it took to be in compliance with their regulator and embrace that. And I think nothing's changed today. And so again, I haven't endorsed a candidate in this race, and I'm just laying out what's happened in the last few days in terms of attitudes. And I do think that, what you say is true about evolving points of view. But I do think the reason I mention it is because I do think politics are coming into play at the federal level, at the state level. I think that there are a growing momentum amongst the digital asset industry, amongst younger people, for candidates that will move forward with putting forward a framework for crypto. And I don't even think they're saying, make it easy. And I don't think they're saying, go light or light touch regulation. They're just simply saying, put the rules in place, albeit soft, albeit hard. Put the rules in place so we can comply. And I think that crypto is going to play a big role in this election. I think it's going to play a big role. I've just come back actually from the UK, where I had a chance to sit down with the head of the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, which is their CFTC, SEC rolled into one. And they are moving forward with a much more clear set of guidelines and rules. And some of that is actually driven by the fact that there's going to be an election in the UK this year. And the Tory party, which are the incumbents that are running for re-election, want to be the champions of crypto. And the way they are approaching it is in a similar fashion. We were going to put down clear rules so that market participants know how to comply, as opposed to necessarily arguing over whether they're easy or hard to follow. The point is, let's just get rules in place.
Well, I think that's really interesting, because a lot of people talk about how Web3, I talk about how Web3 is evolving in a time when technology tools, access to capital, talent, etc., are more globally distributed than they ever have been. When the first era of the web emerged in the 1990s, most of the internet connections, most of the big tech companies, most of the venture capital investors, most of the top computer science programs were in the US, and more specifically in a couple of places like Silicon Valley or Boston and Cambridge. And this time it's very, very different. The US has the lead, but this is one of those moments where everything's kind of happening everywhere all at once. Now that leads to this question of how different governments are reacting to this and how they're positioning themselves. And a lot of people have talked about how there's a global race to attract talent and capital, or to make the country or the city state, in the case of Singapore, a center for innovation in this area. And you mentioned the UK, Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister, said that he wants to make Web3 or make the United Kingdom and Great Britain a Web3 hub for innovation. Andreessen Horowitz relocated or located a European outfit there, and there's this big sort of drive. And the question is that because of clear guidance around new rules, or is it regulatory arbitrage and founders are just looking for the most sort of tax-friendly, light touch jurisdictions? And I think you answered that question, right? Which is that, you're talking to the head of the regulator who's doing both the CFTC and the SEC's role in the UK, and they're talking about clearly defined rules. And I think that should give a lot of people pause in places like the US and Canada. Canada is a country that tracks the US and its regulatory approach to these issues. And I wonder if we're going to be left behind. Maybe not the States, but because it's yours to lose ultimately, but other jurisdictions that aren't thinking about how to position themselves.
So 30 years ago, when the first wave of the internet, which the internet of information, rolled across the globe, and you've written about this in a number of your books, it came out of Silicon Valley and rolled across the globe. But the United States was very deliberate then in establishing an approach to that Internet of Information that was called first do no harm. In fact, the United States Congress, working then with in fact, it was very bipartisan because the Congress was then under the control of Republican leadership, working with the Clinton White House, adopted a series of rules and ultimately legislation that instructed the United States to not either tax this into oblivion or take other steps that would harm this innovation. And that political response to that political response to the Internet of Information 30 years ago was replicated around the globe, so much so that when the closed societies of this world sought to craft an internet for their use that would similarly be closed for their use, it was the Western democracies led by the United States that put a stop to it and insisted that the Internet of Information be an open architecture that couldn't be purloined and dominated by the non-democracies, the closed societies of the world. The sad part about what's happening in the United States right now is actually not, yes, it is about all the engineering talent that are going out, leaving the United States to work abroad, to build their companies abroad. But I think the bigger loss is the loss of leadership built upon the principles of free society. What the United States' greatest contribution in many ways to the first wave of the internet was a governance structure that was founded on the principles of free markets, free rights of individual citizens to make choices. And right now, I think we're surrendering that intellectual leadership about how to regulate it. I don't think the United States' current hostility is sustainable. I think it's an outlier in U.S. history. I think it's an outlier in the global response to crypto. I think it's an outlier in American politics. I think it tends to be limited to a small clique on the left. But I don't think, and for all those reasons, I don't think it's sustainable. But in the short term, it means the United States is surrendering leadership about how to govern this. And it's an opportunity for other jurisdictions that don't have this hostility to assert leadership principles. And so I mentioned I was in the UK, but I literally last week was in Tokyo. It was Japan FinTech Week, and I spent some time with the JFSA, the Japanese Financial Services Authority, and their leadership, and their approach to crypto, notwithstanding Mt. Gox, notwithstanding a number of failures, has remained open-minded throughout and quite world-leaving. Japan is going to be a major player in setting the governance standards for this new wave. China is going to be a major player in setting the governance standards. The UK is going to be a major player. The EU, Canada are going to be setting the standards. And as an American, I say sadly, the United States is relatively absent in leadership. What leadership the United States is asserting is conflating financial stability with maintaining the status quo of TradFi.
Yeah.
And that's not going to work in the long run. The thing about technology is you can't stop it. Kodak could not stop digital photography and Snapchat, and U.S. postal system couldn't stop email. And those are just two fairly pedestrian observations. A new digital architecture of value is arriving on the scene. And if the United States is not going to assert leadership in how to govern this new transition, other countries will step in. And that's fine if those other countries have democratic traditions. But it's not fine if it's the closed societies of the world that use their economic might and power to assert principles that make the digital future of value one that's safe for surveillance, safe for control, safe for censorship.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the need for leadership. And I want to actually use that as an opportunity to pivot to a form of leadership and a form of success that we have had in North America and in the US, and that's around the ETFs. So as you know, Canada actually authorized crypto asset ETFs as early as February of 2021. We were one of the first companies to actually launch one back then. The 9-Point Bitcoin Trust got converted into an ETF structure in May of that year. And now we have the US with its own ETFs. Now, people maybe don't know this, but one of the reasons why the SEC kind of had no choice on this matter was because of the joint surveillance by the CFTC and the SEC, and the fact that there was a regulated futures market for Bitcoin and Ether as well. And I want to get to that in a second. So as the chair of the CFTC, you were instrumental in bringing a lot of this under the CFTC jurisdiction and really pushing and making the case for why you do need a regulated market. And now we've seen the success of these ETFs in terms of flows. It's broken all records. We've talked about it at length on this show, but it's worth repeating that in a matter of 40, 50 days, Bitcoin ETFs have gathered a net amount of more than 10 billion US dollars, which is more than which is as much as gold ETFs took in the first 2 years and S&P 500 ETFs took in their first 3 years. So clearly there was a lot of demand from an alternate investor set looking for exposure. And now they have a safe, low-cost option that is under the jurisdiction of the regulators. And that doesn't take away from people who want to self-custody and use Bitcoin as a peer-to-peer payment tool. It just gives people another way to own and invest in this asset class. So in my view, that was a form of leadership, and you were the person who was leading the charge at the time, even though the event itself actually happened after you had moved on to the private sector. So thanks to you. That's not a question. That's just a moment of
Thank
appreciation.
You. You know, and I myself have written a book, as you know. In fact, you very kindly have supported me in that, called CryptoDad, The Fight for the Future of Money. And it's a recounting, in some ways, of our greenlighting of Bitcoin futures, because it's important to recall that that was not a slam dunk. That was something of a close run thing. We faced opposition from many regulators, including regulators in Europe especially, who I love to see now they've got their MiCA legislation. But 5 years ago, they were opposed to the CFTC greenlighting Bitcoin futures and the argument that we were going to legitimize Bitcoin at a time where they were uncertain as to whether it had legitimacy. But we were also opposed by industry. I mean, there was a full-page ad taken out in the Wall Street Journal addressed to me as chairman of the CFTC, warning me and the agency not to go forward with Bitcoin futures lest it cause potential financial collapse. And a number of the big traditional finance banks were opposed to Bitcoin futures as well, although, you know, within weeks they became some of the largest market makers in the product. But, you know, there was a lot of opposition, and we stood our ground on the basis that it was not for government bureaucrats to legitimize an otherwise lawful product. If Congress had the guts to outlaw it, that would be one thing. But as long as it was legal, our position was it was our job, it was our duty to build a regulatory framework around it. It was not our job to legitimize or delegitimize it. If people wanted to trade it, it was our job to create a regulatory structure around it. And in so doing, we proved 5 years ago that regulators, including US regulators, can engage successfully with crypto and build well-functioning, well-supervised, transparent, deep and liquid markets around it. So it worked very, very successfully. And as you say, I'm very proud of the fact that we wouldn't have a US Bitcoin ETF today had we not had the courage to do that 5 years ago. So I am indeed proud of that. But I think that's just one skirmish in a longer war for this new innovation. Ultimately, there's no stopping the innovation. And I think any thoughtful person recognizes that this is not going away. The real question, I'm so glad to be with you today because I want your listeners to think about this. The real question is, how do we make sure that the Internet of Value doesn't get purloined and usurped by central big tech or big bank companies in the same way that, you know, that the promise of the early Internet became Web 2, where all of us are just basically products for big tech? How do we make sure that in an era of decentralized systems of value, that we don't once again see a degree of centralization where there are big players, whether those big players be China with its digital yuan, whether those big players be technology-based stablecoin operators, or whether they be holders of mining power on decentralized networks to, in a sense, make an illusion of all the economic independence we hope that the Internet of Value will bring to us. I think that's really got to be the question of the future. It's going to be less about the Internet of Value, but an Internet of values. And how do we get the values right? How do we make sure that the value proposition of an Internet of Value is one that reflects the individual rights, the civil liberties, the individual rights to autonomy and economic choice that free citizens presume to enjoy in our democratic societies?
Yeah, there's so much there to unpack. I love the idea of Internet of Values and this notion that this is a technology which at its core is freedom enabling, in the sense that it's permissionless, anyone can access it. It's when it comes to assets like Bitcoin and others, it's self-custodial. You're not relying on a trusted third party or a central authority to tell you what has value or to enable you to do what you want with the things that have value. And I think that's at its core the most important part of this. And I think when it comes to the ETFs, there's been some critique from some corners of the crypto industry that, everyone's celebrating the fact that these large, powerful companies are now the biggest buyers of this asset. And this is how many new, users, investors are getting exposure to it. And doesn't that run counter to it? And I think it's worth reflecting on that. My personal view is that, it's not like you can't still use it yourself. And there are all sorts of amazing new innovations happening that make custodying crypto assets and using them in Web3 applications as a tool to make payments and so forth actually easier. So if anything, it's just more innovation. And I think all kinds of innovation should be welcome. But it is interesting to consider the idea that, technology is just a tool. It has no moral agency. It may be freedom enabling, but that doesn't mean it's always totally resistant to control. And I think that there are some concerns about that as well. You in the research for my book, Web3, Charting the Internet's Next Economic and Cultural Frontier, I interviewed you and we had a conversation that was typical of our many conversations, meaning it was full of great insight. And at the time you said that money was too important to be left to the central bankers. Do you remember that conversation in that particular quote?
Yes, indeed.
And I'm wondering if you can just expound on that a little bit. Tell us what you mean exactly. And let's talk about that idea of innovation happening and it being resistant to this authoritarian impulse.
Sure. It's a quote that I use widely, but I have to say, its origins are kind of interesting. At the end of World War I, after all the carnage and bloodshed and loss of life that came about, especially young life that suffered in World War I, French Premier Clemenceau remarked, he said, maybe war's too important to be left to the generals. In other words, maybe just having the general say, well, let's have an offensive here, let's fight here, needs some degree of more popular input through people's elected representatives. I reflected on that in thinking about the coming Internet of Value, and especially about central bank digital currency. The future of money is as much a social construct as it is a government construct. And we cannot leave the development of systems of value, systems of digital money in the hands of whether it be central bankers or even government administrations that will see it only in terms of how does it address their duties and responsibilities, which is entirely fine. But society has its own set. In fact, with any type of fiat money, whether it's digital or analog, it's only society's trust in it that gives its value. And so society's got as much to say about the form and function, and I believe the values inherent in digital money and in digital systems of money. I'm increasingly becoming an advocate that the United States should require that anything in the new digital future that references the dollar, is based upon the dollar, is stabilized with the dollar, or is in fact a liability of the government, should require to reflect the values of free society. There should be privacy obligations. There should be obligations on any whether it's a stablecoin operator or otherwise that operates a dollar-based system to respect the privacy rights, to not do censorship, not do surveillance on the activities of the people that use it. And I know the concerns have been well raised about central bank digital currency, but I think those same concerns apply to private forms of digital currency as well. I say the same should apply to whether it's sovereign or non-sovereign forms of digital currency. And we also need to think about this in terms of the imposition of what we call AML, KYC, anti-money laundering, know your customer requirements on digital wallets for decentralized systems of value. Because the same way of surveilling people that we all worry about in CBDC could also be present in decentralized systems of value through the forced compliance of wallet providers with AML, KYC, and the gathering of that information for surveillance purposes.
Well, it's interesting, and I think it applies not only to CBDCs and to stablecoins, but also to the web writ large. In the book, I talk about the metaverse, and there's different definitions, but this idea that there's a shared new human experience online, and people are spending more time there, they're having more social interactions, they're spending more money, they're consuming more services and content. And if that's going to be a mirror image of our real world, then we need to ensure that the values in the real world that are actually enshrined in law appear as values in that metaverse as well. And right now, that's really not the case in terms of where most people think of the metaverse going. I think when most people think of the metaverse, they think of Facebook creating a virtual world where you put on their proprietary headset and you're in their proprietary environment, and anything you buy or earn can't be taken out of that, and the company sets the rules, you have no privacy, and all your data belongs to the platform. And to me, that's not a new shared reality. That's virtual Disneyland, right? That's a theme park on the internet, and that's fine. I mean, look, theme parks are what they are, but they're not pushing us forward as a civilization. And so I think that any kind of economic system of values online, including money and personhood and so forth, should include a basic right to privacy, the ability to own and control your own assets, and the ability, property rights, and then the ability to have sort of economic freedom, meaning that in the same way that you're allowed to do business across state lines in the United States, you should be able to do business across different states online, right? Different environments online, and that doesn't exist either. Right now, these are all closed, siloed spaces, and so I think that these issues of how do you program your values into money online so that it reflects the best and eliminates or mitigates the worst is an important and urgent question. And I'm glad that you're still involved in trying to answer that. I want to just pivot because I have a question I want to try and get an answer from you on. And that's that going back to the ETF discussion, we talked about the Bitcoin ETF and how the fact that there's joint surveillance and the fact that there's a regulated futures market were all big contributors to Bitcoin getting approval. Now, that doesn't mean that other assets are going to become ETFs, but there's another asset that does look awfully similar to Bitcoin in that respect, and that's Ether, right? You've had regulated futures markets in Ethereum for, I think, 4 years. And in almost every other respect, it's quite similar to Bitcoin in terms of what the SEC was looking at. Now, there's this May deadline that's coming up for the Ether ETF. There are two applications that are in. One's by Van Eck. I can't remember the other one. But basically, a lot of people are thinking like, well, the Bitcoin ETF got approved, so the Ether ETF's right around the corner. What's your view on that? Like, do you think that just because Bitcoin got approved, that Ether is going to get approved? Like, what kind of odds would you put on it? I'm just curious what your perspective is, having been in that role at one point.
Yeah, so I won't play the odds maker here, but what I will give you is some personal experience with a very similar fact pattern. So once we green-lighted Bitcoin futures at the CFTC in December 2017, in a very similar situation to what's happening now at our sister agency, the SEC, we were immediately approached by many market participants about greenlighting an ETH future. And we went down that road right away. We began studying it. Now, for us, it had not been recognized in any jurisdiction. We knew we would be an agency of first impression. We began that work in the spring of 2018. by the spring of 2019, so a year later, we were getting very close to going forward with that. Now, part of the process at the CFTC was working with the SEC and confirming their views on the topic. And my agency then worked very closely with our counterpart at the SEC. And by the summer, but we didn't get it done in 2018. It was done in 2019.
Yeah, so right.
So it took 18 months.
But still, it was those products have been around for 5 years. Then the ETF.
The point I want to make is that the success of the Bitcoin ETF directly led to work being done on Ethereum, which resolved itself successfully. Now, as I described before, never faced interference from the Trump administration. There was no official policy of resistance. I don't know the current dynamics, so I don't. My hunch would be it's not going to follow on that quickly as perhaps market participants would want. But on the flip side of that, I think directionally it will happen.
Yeah.
And I just can't tell you when.
That's basically what we're hearing from a lot of other really thoughtful, plugged-in people, which is just because it happened with Bitcoin doesn't mean it's going to happen right away with ETH. Like, there's lots of reasons why they may want to delay or defer to consider the facts, or maybe kick the can down the road, however you want to approach it. But that it's sort of not a matter of.
Well, and one other thing I'll say in defense of if I could.
Yeah.
I could say just defense of the regulators. One of the things we wanted at the CFTC is to gain some experience and sophistication in the Bitcoin futures market before we brought in a second, right? We needed to develop the research capability, the market surveillance capability, the understanding of dynamics, to live through a cycle or two to see how that worked. I would imagine that in its best light, there are serious folks at the SEC right now who are saying, look, give us a minute to just absorb what we're seeing in the Bitcoin ETF. It's evolving so fast. Give us a chance to develop our practices and procedures and surveillance techniques. So I think for those who are hoping a decision, in the next 90 days, my hunch is that's probably premature. And for, there's good reasons for that, as well as maybe policy reasons. I think the good reasons are simply the people whose job it is to surveil this every day are learning techniques and possibilities, and they're probably testing out different surveillance tools and other techniques to gain expertise before they take on a second asset class.
Yeah, and I think that's totally reasonable. One sort of counterpoint, which is that in Canada, it was 45 days or 50 days, I think, between when the Bitcoin ETF got approved and the Ether ETF. So our OSC here didn't need much time to...
God forbid a U.S. regulator ever asked for help on a fellow overseas regulator.
Well, it's not even overseas. I mean, we're basically like a sub...
you know what I mean. I just mean
division,
that,
a subdivision of the...
Pride gets in the way of asking for advice and assistance,
Yeah. Chris, it's been such an amazing conversation. I feel like we could go on and on, but I'd love to just sort of wrap it up here by asking you a little bit about what you're up to today. We've talked about the CFTC side of things, and you have mentioned the book. It's worth repeating. Chris has got a great book called CryptoDad. I urge you all to check it out. And as I said at the outset, I've become a crypto dad, and as you know, I already have a crypto dad. My own dad, but I've always thought of you as kind of like my crypto uncle. So you can be crypto uncle.
Your American cousin.
Yes, my American cousin. So tell us a little bit about what you're up to now. Do you plan on writing another book?
I'm having the time of my life right now.
All these various
I'm doing a portfolio of things. I mentioned I was just in Tokyo. Among other things I was doing in Tokyo was actually signing the new Japanese language edition of CryptoDad, which was a lot of fun. For a great audience, and the book is doing well. I think we're selling over 22,000 copies right now as an author. For a first time.
Yeah, that's
you're a 3-time author, but for me as a first time, I'm very pleased with that. I'm senior counsel at a great law firm in New York called Willkie, Farr, and Gallagher, where I head up its digital works practice, and the firm is very quickly established one of the premier digital asset practices here in the United States, and we're very proud and doing some great work with some great entrepreneurs in building some really fine firms. I'm on a board. I'm a board member of a number of companies, both publicly traded companies, as well as private. I'm an advisor to a whole range of early stage companies exploring digital assets and the metaverse. And I'm also, and something I'm very proud of, co-founder and executive chairman of the Digital Dollar Project. And if I can just take one more minute,
please.
Digital Dollar Project is not an advocacy organization for the U.S. to roll out a CBDC, but we are a nonpartisan charity, what we call a 501c3 in the United States, focused on, in a coming world of both decentralized and highly centralized systems of value. And some of those highly centralized ones will be run by governments, and some will be run by big technology companies and big banking institutions. We ask the question that nobody seems to be really asking in the United States is, how do we future-proof the dollar for that coming world? How do we preserve its reserve currency status? And how do we do so maintaining the values that I think historically the dollar seemed to stand for? Values of free markets, of free enterprise, of free autonomous activity for lawful financial transactions. And so we're focused on this. We see the future as being very different than the past. Value is going to move to a new architecture, an internet-based architecture of finance. And if we don't think ahead as Americans for what is the role of the dollar in that world, we might not like the outcome. And so that's what we're doing at the Digital Dollar Project. And it's my way of giving back after 40 years on Wall Street and government. I've had a wonderful career, and I'm having some of the most fun I've ever had right now. And I'm also given a chance to give back through our work at the Digital Dollar Project. And take a look at our work, digitaldollarproject.org. I think your listeners will find that very interesting.
Well, they certainly will. And it is important work. And stable coins and the dollar are a big topic on the show. We talk about USDC versus USDT and the rise of CBDCs as a topic. And USDT actually is a kind of a form of retail Eurodollar product that basically allows people outside of the US to conveniently own and move dollars, which more than anything is like a financial super duper power for most people, right? Yes. And so this is all at an important time. We're talking about an important topic. So we're glad to have you involved in that and leading it in many respects. Chris, it's been a great conversation. Thank you again so much for your time and insights. I always learn more than one new thing and get inspired along the way. Can you tell us a little bit about where people can find out more about the Digital Dollar Initiative, all the good stuff?
Great. So the Digital Dollar Project is digitaldollarproject.org. And my website is cryptodad.org or chrisgiancarlo.org. And of course, I'm at the firm of Willkie, Farr, and Gallagher in New York, Willkie.com.
And you're on Twitter too.
And I'm on Twitter too. Giancarlo Markets, MKTS. Giancarlo MKTS.
A great
follow me on Twitter.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Chris, again. We hope to have you back on the show. Great to see you. And we'll chat again soon, I'm sure. Take care.
Can't wait to see you again, Alex. Take care.
Bye.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.